So lots of introductions, but as a way of introducing myself, my name's Anthony Handley. My title at Magenic, I work with Jim, is User Experience Practice Lead for our design team, Magenic Studios. Beyond that, I've been a designer for about 20 years. I kind of fancy myself as a technologist as well. I was a Microsoft MVP for about 7 years in Windows development. But beyond that, I like to think of myself as a problem solver, first and foremost. When we're working with collaborative teams to build software, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with enterprise customers and consumer customers to solve problems with their users. And so I really like to kind of position myself as that. It's a little esoteric, but really, I mean, wouldn't we all say we're definitely trying to solve problems? Yeah? So before we get into the agenda, just so I have an idea of the audience, I have a lot of content. Some of it might be very fundamental or basic. What's that? Good call. Guess I should share my screen. That would help. Sorry about that on the phone for the guys. Okay, so before we get into the agenda, I want to get an idea of the audience. I want to make sure that we're not going to cover anything too in-depth that you guys already know. So how many people would identify themselves as a developer? Okay, a lot of developers. Any designers? I saw we had one designer. Okay, executive, AEs, business level, C-level. Okay, so a good mix. All right, good. From an agenda perspective, I'm going to cover a little bit about why we're here. We're going to, give an overview of the topic, user experience in Agile development. We'll talk a little bit about Agile. We'll just kind of level set, an understanding when we say Agile, what do we mean? Does anybody not know what Agile development is or has not worked in Agile development? One, okay. Probably won't go in too depth. We're going to do a very high level, but I don't want to have too much repetition of content you guys already know. And then we'll talk about user experience. We'll talk about why user experience is so important. What is user experience? What does it really mean to us? And how is it a channel for us to then create better software for our users? And then the topic at hand, how do we then integrate user experience design, deliverables, and activities into the iterative or the Agile process? Now I'll use Agile and iterative kind of interchangeably. Sometimes Agile means something very, very specific, but ultimately what we're talking about is iterative development in software. So that's really the focus. And then we'll talk about how it all fits together, some of the lessons learned, and how to best start to approach integrating UX into design process. So I know we had a couple of designers. Is there anybody that has felt like they've successfully integrated UX design onto an Agile project or to an Agile shop? Okay, couple, good, okay. All right, well, hopefully this is going to be, some good conversation. I'm not really the kind of guy that likes to present as a talking head, so we don't need to wait till the end of the session. If you guys have questions, raise your hand. I'll repeat them for those on the phone, and hopefully we'll have some good dialogue as we go through this, okay? So why are we here? The title of the session, start thinking about UX in Agile development. Really what we want to do then is figure out, we've technically had this completely siloed process of designing and developing, where the designer worked completely outside of the development process, handed his assets over, and then the developer went through and tried to code them. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between Agile and waterfall in that way, but if you're an Agile shop now and you're starting to deliver solutions in an iterative way, how do we then start to include the UX approach and process into that cadence so that we're having more collaboration and more effective software solutions for our users and their customers? So just a little bit about Agile versus waterfall. Whenever I think about waterfall development, this is probably a 20-year-old comic, but I think it pretty accurately describes some of the disconnects in communication that can come to bear when we actually develop software in a completely linear fashion, when we're not taking the time to solicit iterative feedback and actually build responsibly the software solutions for our customers. The first picture, how the customer explained it, it looks like a tree swing with three seats on it. I don't know how you would actually sit on that if one of them's a footstool. I've actually seen this interchanged a few times as far as who the different roles were, who described it, how it was designed, how it was sold to the customer. how the project was documented, which obviously we have zero documentation in this example. What operations installed, what the customer was billed. I really like the fact that we're talking about a tree swing and they were billed for a roller coaster. How it was supported, cut off at the knees, and then ultimately what the user needed. So I think this is this always made me laugh, and I think it's a really good description of some of the disconnect on communication that we've had in software development in the past. So from a waterfall approach, has everybody worked on a waterfall project in their career? Yeah, so certainly the whole step by step we gather the requirements, then we design the user experience, then we code it, then we test it, then we deploy it. And if we've built software in 3 to 6 months, then we wait until we deploy it, then we wait for the deluge of customer complaints and requests for support because users weren't necessarily included in the entire process with the rest of the team. So we all understand the pain that comes along with developing software in this linear fashion, which is why I think more agile and iterative ways of developing software came to bear. Now, when I describe agile software to people that don't know what it is, I really break it down. It's quite a lengthy and complex process, but if I were to break it down into its component parts, really the source of agile development is the backlog of features, right? The user stories. So, setting off on an agile development process, we create that backlog. We find out what the business and the users need, and we gather those all up and create user stories and features in the backlog. And then we prioritize them. What's really important to the business? What do we need to accomplish first? How do we then order those so we can be successful? And then we break those into those sprints. And ultimately then when we work in a sprint, we're taking those chunks, we're developing, we're signing off on them, and then we're moving on to another piece. The advantages to this, we all know the advantages to leveraging a backlog. Let me jump into this one really quick. There's a lot more visibility into how the project's doing. We're constantly delivering. There's a reduction in risk because there's more visibility. There's often been some gaps and some chasms between what IT's objectives are and what the business is trying to accomplish. So this is another way for some additional communication channels to happen when we're trying to solve problems. We get better software from a quality perspective as well. If I talked about the backlog a little bit, certainly I view the backlog as that ultimate to-do list, right? Instead of having some esoteric requirements that took 6 months to write and then won't be touched again for another 6 months as we build software, that backlog is something that can be adjusted and changed with feedback as we iterate through the process, right? Now, is any of this foreign to anybody else? I mean, does this seem like it makes sense? This is how we work today. It's a responsible way to build software. Yes? Resonating? Okay. So I just wanted to level set a little bit. And then we'll talk about user experience before we talk about integrating them in there. So when we say user experience, what do we mean? And why should we care about the user experience? I mean, isn't it really just a question of writing really great code and releasing software and everything is going to go really well? How many people think that user experience is often described as being the same as user interface? UX, we hear UX, UI all the time. Sometimes visual design. Huge pet peeve of mine. I never say UX/UI. It's just UX. So user experience is typically seen as just the visual design or maybe the user interface design, but these are all several different aspects of what a user experience designer does, the types of roles that they can play, the types of inputs that they can have, and the contributions that they can have when developing software. Now, a lot of these things sometimes are handled by different roles. When we're helping to gather requirements, when we're looking at those user stories, when we're contributing to the backlog in the Agile process, a lot of these things have overlaps. But again, collaboration is the key here. We're talking about user experience, not only looking at the look and feel, the pretty, right? Making, how many times have you heard, get a designer to make my application look pretty? User experience isn't just about making it look pretty. User experience is how the software works to the user. Okay, it's so much more than just that look and feel, that veneer. User experience has been very, very important in the consumer space for years. Consumer applications, consumer websites, but the enterprise has kind of ignored user experience to a large degree. And so when we look at the fact that we're not necessarily trying to wow our users with great user experience, we're not trying to give them a completely happy moment or joyous overview. What we're trying to do is we're trying to solve problems of productivity. We're trying to increase efficiencies in the enterprise. When you're looking at a line of business application, Sure, looking great, an application that looks great is an advantage, and you definitely want to make sure that you have a visual component that is pleasing to the eye. But really what we're trying to accomplish by engaging in a UX process in the enterprise is productivity. Is everybody here working with enterprise level, consumer versus enterprise? Let's talk about this. Enterprise, people working in the enterprise, okay. People working in the consumer space, a couple, okay. So this was actually quite a hard sell about 5 years ago. Why do we care about design? You know, we're going to give software to our users and we're going to make them use it, so we don't really care what it looks like. Productivity and efficiencies were affected by this. Let's look at some stats. I found some fun stats coming in here. When we think about why user experience is so important, I don't have to tell any of the designers in the room. There's been some research by Forrester. They say that 97% of websites fail when it comes to user experience. That's almost every site has something wrong with it from a user experience perspective. And what we mean by fail, meaning that the user experience is not conducive to accomplishing a task or a goal. When I come to a website, I have something in mind that I need to do, whether it be consumer or an enterprise internal website. 97%. That looks like that there's some work we can do. Jacob Nielsen, who knows who Jacob Nielsen is? The designers, a couple of people, yeah. So he's some people call him the father of modern web usability. I call him the godfather of modern web usability. I think it's much more exciting. But he says to help combat some of those problems that we're having, the 97% of the problems that we're having in websites, if you test with just 5 users, that's all you really need. 5 representative users of the different user types or user roles from a persona that you've identified as a user in your project. Testing can help you identify 85% of those problems. As a developer or as a designer, if I don't have connectivity and conversations and communication with the users, I'm really designing that application for me or the developer that I'm sitting next to. Who are the users? Am I designing for them? Am I empathizing with their needs? Am I putting myself in their shoes and designing a solution for them so that they can actually accomplish their tasks and increase that productivity and be more productive? Because really when we're talking about productivity, we're talking about the bottom line in the enterprise. Regardless of the type of application, what we're trying to do is we're trying to save money or make money, right? I mean, anybody that thinks that we're in business for anything more ultimately than making money is probably fooling themselves. We want to enjoy what we do, we want to have satisfaction, but ultimately we're trying to make money. And productivity and efficiency are part of those bottom lines. For the developers in the room, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this statistic. I found it on social media today when they were talking about the ROI of user experience. According to the research, 50% of a developer's time is spent fixing errors that could have been avoided with a little bit of UX planning up front. Talking to the stakeholders, vetting ideas in front of users, and making sure that we're accomplishing those goals. It's not even necessarily a question of vetting a particular user flow, but is there an intuitive aspect to what we're delivering? Did it make sense to the user? Did it accomplish that goal of getting them what they need and basically being useful, the utility of the application? So if you look at the fact that if you design an application that takes you 6 months to design and develop, but you're not having the connection with those users, half of that time is spent fixing problems that you introduced in the first part. So these are some pretty heavy-duty numbers. So we talk about why good user experience design is so important in the enterprise, because it's a level of differentiation. It's going to help you compete when you're actually speaking to the users and looking at their needs and speaking to those needs, increasing the productivity and the usability and the efficiency. Suddenly, when you're talking to your CEO and to your board, the bottom line is what counts. And if you can show that a little bit of time spent connecting with users in a UX process, bringing those users as stakeholders into the process, we'll talk a little bit about that. That's what we want to do. In addition to efficiencies and productivity, ease of use, trust in the system, a reduction in error. These are some of the things that we enjoy when we have good UX planning up front. We spend less time developing, we spend less time supporting, we spend less time training when we consider the user, put ourselves in their shoes, and create an intuitive experience that they can just start using. Okay? This all seems like common sense, right? Well, how come we haven't been doing it for 20 years? I don't know. We're doing it now. So where does UX live? Where does the UX process exist? I like to think of it as sitting in the middle of a trifecta between working with the business to identify what their needs are, helping them to identify their users, connect with their users, and understand who their users are and what their users' needs are, and then also technology considerations. When I first started working in visual design and web design, we were very, very cut off from the developers. We didn't talk to the developers. We worked in Photoshop and made the most amazing looking websites you could possibly imagine in 1996, which were, now you look at those and they're pretty flat. But then tossing those comps or the design guidelines over to the developers and wishing them luck. Hey, how come that button has rounded corners on it? We can't do that. So there are a lot of technology advances that have come into play that allow for better collaboration. But again, having technology considerations into the UX process and having UX process considered by technology is something that gets left in the dust sometimes. And so we're not only working with business stakeholders, we're not only working with users, we're helping to identify what are the technology constraints. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the process and where those touch points happen. So the designers in the room, will think this looks very, very familiar. Everybody has their own flavor or their own version of the process, but if you look at software development, really what you're doing is you're doing discovery. What do we need to build? We're designing it, we're developing it, we're testing and we're releasing it. Basically 4 steps, give or take. So when we look at UX activities and deliverables as a part of this process, in that discovery phase, when we're looking at capturing what are we building, it's not only talking to the business and understanding what the goals of the business are, but identifying who the users are and what their needs are. So we talk about user research during the discovery process. And then, in a very, very common way, we see user flows, storyboards, wireframes, prototypes. These are the typical outputs from UX that we've probably come to expect. Sometimes into front-end development, HTML and CSS generation. But prototyping, visual design, and branding, these are all things that we expect to come out of design. And we can certainly work in an iterative fashion in this process, but that still sometimes happens completely outside the context of iterative development. If we break down a little bit and talk about what those deliverables are, user research and evaluation, this is again where we're connecting with those users. There's lots of different ways we can find out who the users are and what they're trying to accomplish. Interviews, questionnaires, focus groups, a lot of different methods. But really having the conversation with the user is the key. Who are you? How do you get through your day? What kind of systems do you use? Pain points do you have? What do you need to be successful? These are the things that sometimes the business doesn't know. Sometimes the business does, and we can connect with the users to confirm or validate those assumptions. But sometimes they're assumptions. Sometimes it's a contentious relationship between users and an organization. They might put a software product in front of the users, and they say, what do you think of this? Oh, I think this is great. I don't want to call your baby ugly. Love it. But maybe they really hate it, or maybe it doesn't really meet their needs. So a designer can kind of come in and be that intermediary, that third party, that objective conduit between users and a business stakeholder sometimes. We can help capture the needs of the user, read between the lines, catch the nuances of what they're trying to accomplish. Some of the other ways we evaluate during user research, heuristic evaluation. This is a way to evaluate a website or an application without knowing anything about the users, based on common best practices. Jacob Nielsen, that we mentioned earlier, has a list of 10 of them. Am I able to recover from errors quickly and easily? Am I able to navigate a system and find my way through the application very quickly and easily? Is there a natural and consistent alignment with the real world system in a digital space? Some of these things that are just kind of, that make sense and are common across digital products, sometimes we can catch some of the usability problems without even talking to the users. And then competitive analysis. Why reinvent the wheel? What's my neighbor doing? What kind of problems has he had? How has he solved them? We can learn a lot. User flows, this is then once we understand what we're going to build, once we have requirements, let's flesh those out. Let's whiteboard, let's iterate, let's prototype. Let's tell the story from screen to screen to screen. This is all very, very high level. Sometimes we do user flows just on a whiteboard and take a picture. Sometimes we're in something like Visio to tell a little more of a complete story. But really the goal here is to map out. We've got our directions. We've got the requirements. Now let's map out those directions when we're on that journey. And then wireframes and mockups. This is probably the most common deliverable that can come out of a designer that everybody's probably seen come out of a designer that they've worked with. From sketches to more low to medium fidelity wireframes, all the way up to the high resolution mockups. What is it going to look like in a pixel perfect representation of the application before we build it? Okay, common deliverables. But this, I think, is the most useful, and especially as we talk about integrating user experience deliverables and approaches into the Agile environment, prototyping is going to play a key role. Sometimes people think that prototyping is you have to have an application that prototypes. I need Acture to prototype. I need UXPin to prototype. I need Indigo Studio from Infragistics to prototype. I need to be able to put screens in and wire them up and let users click them. But really a prototype, yes, typically that is a prototype using software. But sometimes it's a paper prototype. Any type of method that lets you communicate a particular interaction or way of thinking or moving through an application and being able to solicit feedback and make sure that your assumptions and that the ideas that you're bringing to bear are valid and that you're on the right track. This is a great way for us to get back in front of those stakeholders and users, solicit that feedback, and then be able to pivot if we need to in the Agile environment. Yes, sir?
Do you have any data, or can you talk to benefits of the rapid prototyping type of approach vis-a-vis a wireframe or a mock-up, which will be more static as opposed to a more interactive prototyping?
Yeah, so for those on the phone, the question is there any type of demonstrable examples, between doing more static wireframing and something that's maybe more clickable and interactive, right? I don't have any stats on that. From my personal experience, we've gotten to a point, and we'll talk about tool sets in a little bit, but we're not having to move from one to another and have those be throwaway. The tool sets now allow us to start with pencil sketches, scan them in, wire them up really quick, and let me click through them. Then I can start to replace those with more medium fidelity wireframes, but then still have them be clickable. So it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If it's a common interaction that doesn't need to be tested or vetted, if it's part of a design language, if you're working for an organization and you have a common design library or paradigm that if your sign-in screen always works the same way, are you going to spend hours and time wireframing and prototyping that every single time? Is what maybe you're asking? Yeah. So the answer is, this is all going to change. What we want to look at these activities and deliverables is foundational. And then what we do is we can cherry pick and figure out what makes the most sense to a particular engagement. And there are a lot of different factors. There's the type of environment that the client is in. There's the platform. There's the roles. There's the people that we're able to have access to. So, if I'm in a room with a bunch of UX designers and all I have to do is vet my ideas with them versus a completely an end user that has no idea what they're even doing on a particular system. So again, judging who your audience is, sometimes a wireframe is enough. Sometimes you don't have to wire it up, but the tool set lets you start in a tool, in an application to create something that's maybe more static, and then when you're ready to wire it up, if you need to, you can. So when we talk about those tools, that's a good way to do it. Okay? So we had a little bit of a foundation. We talked about Agile. We talked about why waterfall is awful, and we talked about what user experience is and why we care about user experience. Are there any questions about user experience just at a fundamental level, why we think it's important? Is there anybody who doesn't think that user experience design is important when we're delivering software? Because then I'll have words with you afterwards. Okay, good. So we're all on the same page. So how does it all fit together? Sometimes we can work in an iterative fashion when we're designing an application, when we're moving through that discovery and that design and that prototyping phase. But that doesn't necessarily align with the Agile development method. And what we do is we don't want to work in completely siloed environments because of those different inputs that I talked about. Not only sitting in between and connecting the needs of the business with the needs of the user and aligning those, but then having those conversations with the development team, the architect, the coders, the QA. These are all inputs. These are all conversations that we all need to be having. When we talk about when we actually vet some of those prototypes, one of the things we talk about is technical viability. If I design something, again, I don't want to design something for 8 to 10 weeks and then toss over the development team and have them panic because, wow, this doesn't even look like it belongs on this platform. Or this won't work. We can't design it this way. The interaction doesn't work. So we want to make sure that we're having these conversations. So if we go back to the backlog, with the backlog being the center, that to-do list, the center of Agile, or iterative development, where does UX fit within that? And we talk about a UX sprint or a design sprint. And ultimately, those activities and deliverables are put into the backlog. Ultimately, this comes back to the tools and the methodology and the process that development uses when they're looking at how they're going to write the code and how they're going to develop. Design does the same thing. We are participants in backlog grooming. We are helping to drive some of those user requirements and some of those user stories by representing the user and representing the user experience. Anybody in an Agile shop ever done like planning poker when you're looking at grooming the backlog? Anybody that, okay, so I only saw a couple of nods or hands. So planning poker is a way for the product owners, the development team, everybody basically involved in crafting the software. When you're looking at fleshing out and grooming that backlog, when I say grooming, taking a look at all those different user stories and prioritizing them and figuring out what the estimate is for them to be built, right? You know, you might have 2 user stories that are going to take an entire sprint, but you might have 10 user stories that you can do all of those in one sprint. So those are some of the prioritizations. But when that planning happens, when that backlog grooming happens without considering the users, without a designer representing those users, the estimates might be off because a developer might say, this is going to take me an entire sprint to develop this feature. It might only take me an hour to design it and validate that design. And vice versa, something that might actually be very complex, a complex interaction that is easy to do, that is easy to code and to build on the back end, might be something that will take me 2 weeks to validate and test because it's something that the users aren't expecting. So we want to make sure that we have that representation during the backlog grooming and the planning, which is why we want to plug into that backlog process. Anybody that is in an Agile shop that uses Team Foundation Server as a backlog? Microsoft would love you guys. Yeah, and ultimately, really, we don't. I mean, I've worked in situations where the design team was working in an iterative fashion, but they had their own copy of a backlog in an Excel spreadsheet, and they were working against that. And then they were handing off updates to the project manager, and the project manager was going into Team Foundation Server and updating everything. What a pain! Why would we not all just be in the same tool? It takes 5 minutes to learn how to use TFS. We should leverage the tools that the developers use as designers. So when we talk about that design sprint, I've mentioned that a couple of times. There's a cadence when we're developing in an iterative fashion, when we're writing code. Same thing with design. We're breaking all of those different phases down. We talked about discovery, design, development, and testing. Well, the different things that come out of UX, we want to vet some ideas. We want to connect with the business stakeholders, validate some ideas, start to ideate, start to whiteboard. What are we thinking about doing? How are we providing a solution? What can we do to service these users in this particular scenario? What are our ideas? Then get it very, very quickly back in front of the stakeholders and users, vet those ideas, solicit feedback. Hey, what do you guys think? On Monday, you told us that you were having this problem. This is the area that we're trying to tackle this week. Here's our solution. Here's our suggested solution. What do you guys think? Yes, this works. No, this doesn't. What about this? It encourages that conversation. So we want to pivot. We want to put the user at the center of everything that we do as a designer. Research, design, test, measure. Were we successful? Did they like what we showed them? Did it matter? Did it make sense? And then we adapt. We solicit that feedback and then we iterate. So if we look at a couple of different things, we look at it like a sprint zero or an initiation, typically described in an Agile or an iterative fashion. This is really some foundational stuff. True Agile, you just start coding on day one. You just start designing on day one. Well, sometimes that works in certain situations, and from my experience, having a little bit of foundation, you don't have to take 6 months and build a business requirements document, but you do need to work within a sprint zero and help to identify what those backlog items are, or at least initially, those high-level user stories, or epics as they call them. So during the sprint zeros, when we're then connecting with the users, engaging in user research, identifying their goals, their pain points, making sure that we're able to effectively represent them from a design perspective and make sure that their voice is heard. We're their representative. We're their advocate for the process, and then participate in that backlog prioritization session. Now, it's not that you go through backlog grooming one time and you're done. You've got your requirements. Typically starts off very high level in some cases. Sometimes it's very detailed. Sometimes it's mind-boggling how general it is. I'm on a project right now, and on the first week, one of the first user stories was user needs to sign into the system. Okay. What data do we need to pass? Do they need to pick a username? Do they need to sign in with a username? Is it an email? Do they need to type in a password? Do they need to authenticate? All of these different intricacies of a sign-in page, something that seems very simple is not. So working with the customer to explain, well, we need a little more detail here. Let's talk through this. Let's whiteboard this out and figure out all the different pieces we need. And the architect says, well, here's all the data that we need. Okay, that's great. Let's get that into the backlog. That all happens in that prioritization and backlog. But it's not a one and done. As you iterate through those sessions, you're often revisiting and reprioritizing that backlog. We talked a little bit about that. That's one of the advantages of building software this way. You might get into a couple of different sprints, and what you've designed and what you've developed might solicit, create some change based on what you're going to be building in the next sprints. Maybe you're reprioritizing. Maybe there's a new feature that the business stakeholder came up with over the weekend, and you need to add it to your backlog. Again, responsible way to develop software. I don't have to build software and wait 6 months to add that new feature. If the business comes and says, hey, this is something that we need to add, let's do it. Let's bring that in. So beyond that sprint 0, once we actually get into the cadence of development sprints, I found it very effective whether it's a 2-week development sprint or a 3-week development sprint. What we like to do is have design sprints or design spikes. And this is a week-long mini sprint, basically. The different things that we do from Monday to Friday, we follow that graphic I had where it's iterative, where we're starting with planning and designing and iterating and pivoting. This is what we're doing. On Monday, we're ideating, right? Okay, project manager and the project team have given us a group of user stories that we need to design on this week, okay? What do these user stories mean? I need some clarification. Let's make sure that we really understand what we're doing. Let's ideate, and then let's start whiteboarding our ideas. Getting into prototyping the very next day. Understanding on day 1 and starting to produce on day 2. When we talk about rapid prototyping, we mean rapid. We're talking about a couple of hours rather than weeks. Vetting our ideas in either a low, medium, or a high fidelity, depending on the tool set that we're using and where we're at, what kind of access to branding guidelines and existing designs that we have. But by Wednesday, we're getting these ideas back in front of the stakeholders, the users. We're vetting the technology choices. Hey, lead architect, this is what I'm thinking. Can we build this? Business stakeholder, you told us that your requirements, that your goals were this. Does this meet those needs? User, you told me you had this existing pain. We think that this is going to solve that. What do you think? Let's test it. Let's touch it. Let's interact with it. Rapid prototyping, again, can be in any form that communicates that interaction effectively, tells that story. We'll solicit feedback, and by Thursday, we're then, kind of consuming, we're considering the feedback, we're iterating. We're right back into, adapting based on the feedback that we've heard. Okay, they really liked most of the layout, but the placement of this particular piece of information didn't make sense to the user in the context of their user scenario. So let's move it where they suggested, and then get it back in front of them and see if that works. Okay, so you can be assigned as a designer working right alongside with the developer the same user stories. Okay, from sprint 1 on. One of the things that we like to do, and we'll talk about this when we talk about best practices and lessons learned on the next couple of slides, is it's sometimes advantageous to get maybe a sprint or even 2 sprints ahead of development. So now when the developers are getting in and looking at their backlog items, and it's not just a question of here's what I need to code and I can start writing code. There's additional inputs into their process as well. They've now got some visuals that they've been a part of vetting and that they understand that they can develop, and they've got some representation from the UX. So again, conversation and collaboration, communication. This is an additional input into the development process. This is something that helps developers. Okay, and then again, confirming, okay, so are we able to, hand these user stories off and move on to another set? Do we need to pivot next week and reevaluate that? Maybe seeing the prototypes really brought a lot of new ideas out to the project team, and we need to reimagine what we're trying to do. So if you look at the 1-week design sprint as sitting on top of the agile development process, you've got if you're in a 2-week sprint, you've got 2 design sprints. We're talking about velocity. We're talking about rapidly vetting those ideas, testing them, soliciting feedback, confirming that we have made some good choices, and then moving on. It's a great way to build software. Yes, sir?
How do you that. So with Sprint Zero, when you're just starting everything at once, how are you getting the design sprints ahead?
Yeah, so because we're having those design sprints or those design spikes within a regular iteration, we can increase that velocity. So the developer might have taken a look at a group of user stories for this sprint and said, this is going to take me 80 hours to write code on this. Okay? I'm working with those same stories, and I say, you know what? I can work all of these stories into my prototype this week, right? I can prototype all of these stories, and that might be, and the stories might be authentication screen and a layout once I'm authenticated in, right? Or maybe one of the user stories is a retrieve password, right? That's going to take the developer. The developer's already said it's going to take me this long to code them, but I'm saying, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tackle all of these in a different amount of time. What it's going to take for me to design it might be different than develop it, right? So if I've done that, if there's 5 user stories in Sprint 1, and the developer is going to work on 2 of them in week 1 and 3 of them in week 2, but I've already validated and prototyped them and got sign-off in 1 week, I can move on to Sprint 2 user stories that second week.
Yeah, what I'm really asking is, so you're beginning, everybody's starting at the same time, developers, UX, everything. So how for that, so you got developers that want to start coding day 1.
Sure.
So if you're preparing design ahead, how does that happen in the beginning?
So sometimes if you've identified some of the user stories during the Sprint 0, you can kind of get a jump even before Sprint 1. That's another way to start. Now again, there's all these different factors. How does the project team work? Who's involved? What's the cadence? This is all done by the project manager and the scrum master, right? But sometimes starting at the same time and then catching up a little bit, it's just like a race, right? I'm gonna run a little faster because I'm doing something different. But maybe in a particular sprint, I'm going to fall back a little bit. You're going to catch back up to me because now my estimation of what it's going to take to design the UX on a particular set of user stories is longer than what it's going to take for you to code on those stories. So it's not a perfect situation, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure you're having those conversations. So if the developer says, hey, I'm going to be writing the code for what you're going to be designing tomorrow. I'm starting that today. You've been a part of those initial, whiteboarding and prototyping sessions, so that doesn't happen outside of development. Your lead architect, your lead developer, your lead QA tester, these are all people that are part of that first day ideation, so everybody knows where we're going and what we're doing. They might make a choice to work on something a little bit different while they're waiting for your prototype one day. So I think the answer to your question then, how do you then maintain getting ahead of them, or how do you get that velocity? And ultimately it depends on working with the project team and having those conversations.
Yeah, we do fine once we get going. It's the starting up is messy. So I thought maybe you had a special timing of how that worked for Sprint 0 and Sprint 1. That's really what I was asking about.
So the question for those on the phone is there a set time or a set process during the Sprint 0? And I would say that there's no easy answer to that because a Sprint 0 might be 1 week, it might be 3 weeks, it might be 5 weeks, right? If we identify, wow, there's a lot of interaction that we need to vet early on before Sprint 1, maybe we're going to take an extra week and have just a design sprint before we start developing in Sprint 1. Okay?
So I think most of the times prototyping can be done as part of the requirements gathering itself because you want to show the prototype to the customer before they sign off.
Sorry, something about prototyping, what was that?
You could do the prototyping during the requirements gathering phase itself so that you show this to the client before the sign off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we talked about, so the question is prototyping earlier in the process. So sometimes when we're doing ideation, when I talked about working against a backlog, sometimes we're sketching, sometimes we're coming up with ideation as we're working, because that's going to then feed it back into the backlog. We don't have to wait until I've actually then spent a sprint or two designing something to make an impact on the backlog. We can actually be whiteboarding and sketching through that process. Because there are going to be times during the backlog grooming process where we're kind of sitting back and listening and consuming, but we can kind of do double duty and start to kind of vet some ideas. The nice thing about software today is there's a couple of different ways of looking at the approach of the design. One, we've got some really great design guidelines and paradigms and interaction models for software, right? Whether that be mobile, whether that be desktop, or beyond. So there's a lot of times where we're talking about at what point do I say my design is going to match those human interface design guidelines exactly? And when am I able to innovate? When if I have an idea that isn't covered in the guidelines that I need to vet out and test. So that's one of the things that prototyping does. So if I'm building an iPhone application and Apple gives me a list of guidelines and says, this is how you should design an iPhone application, it's very clear that there are some really great and well-designed applications that look and feel at home on that platform that are stepping away from those guidelines. Same thing happens on different platforms. You look at different design languages from the different mobile platforms. You look at something like starting with Bootstrap as an HTML and CSS accelerator when you're designing a website. These are all starting points and suggestions, but if we actually go in and say, this is exactly how this has to work without considering what the users are trying to do, without trying to innovate, we're basically all just going to have apps that look and work exactly the same. Now, some people, like the usability godfather Jacob Nielsen, would say, that's great, everything should look and work exactly the same. I should never have to learn anything new ever. But then we're stuck in a rut. We're not getting new features, we're not getting new ideas, we're not learning new ways to interact with information and systems. So yes, to answer your question, prototyping earlier in the process, sometimes even during sprint 0, can be done, absolutely. The nice thing about this process is you understand the different pieces that have to happen. Discovery, design, prototyping, validating, testing, and then iterating. You can do that whenever is appropriate or whenever you can or whenever you need to within the process. You don't have to say, oh, I can't show you, I started developing my prototype on Monday, but I can't show it to you till Wednesday because I'm following the process. That would be silly. What if you're ready to show it to me now? Let's go grab a table over at the coffee shop and let's look at it. Okay? So it's a fluid process. There's some flexibility there.
Do you see where you go ahead a little bit on the designs or UX?
Sorry?
When you go ahead of the sprints, because by virtue, if you follow a Scrum model, right, you time box that time, so that time box is timed.
Absolutely.
In the Kanban method, you can use that method, right? You can go ahead a little bit as the work is
Sure.
there, available.
So we talked about working a little bit ahead, of development. There is some, they're probably beeping me to answer the question. The question was, are we time boxed by that process? And the answer is not always, because what we can do is we can then say, I'm going to prototype a couple of sprints ahead, but you don't want to get too far ahead, because when they actually start seeing some of the code, again, technology is an input into that process, and things might change. And if I'm too far ahead, now I've got to go back and maybe reimagine something. So I think that there's I think, again, depending on the team, as we always hear in technology, it depends, right? I think that it's responsible to work collaboratively with the developers and again, have those communications. If the developer says, whoa, hey, I think that some things might change next week based on what I'm coding, and you're too far down the line, we need to pull back a little bit, we can do that. When we talk about velocity and more of like capacity model in staffing projects, that's kind of where some of those methodologies come to play in the more agile development. But I think, again, these are guidelines, right? This is not a secret sauce. This isn't some huge revelation about how to develop software. It's just logical, and it's trying to ease some of our pain to create really great products, right? Question?
How the UX designer works with the business analyst on requirement gathering? How that overlaps, how they cooperate?
Yeah, so I would say that the number of designers that work kind of during like maybe sprint 0 or the initiation on the backlog is what you're asking?
How they interact with the analysts that they're doing the business requirement gathering, or what's the overlap between the?
I think one of the problems that EY has is we're a waterfall shop.
EY is a waterfall shop, okay?
And it is, right? It's an old school way of thinking, and it's a waterfall shop.
Mm-hmm.
So you got people that want to come in and work with the agile process. You're still working with BAs, solution architects. You got a matrix organization. So the architects will throw up their hands and say, no, we can't do nothing without requirements. Meanwhile, the BAs are trying to gather requirements, but the UX team is trying to develop designs, and so you got this competing constraints always happening. So how do you marry those elements together is the difficult part.
Yeah, so in a waterfall situation, technically design is supposed to ultimately happen only after requirements are done.
Right.
Only if I've spent an exhaustive amount and covered every contingency, plus or minus 20%, right? that I have a very solid document, and this is going to be my Bible. This is my source of truth. I am not going to deviate from this. We are going to design this exactly as specified. We're going to develop it, and we're going to give it to the users. Okay? There's really no other way around that. The only thing that I would suggest is within each of those phases, you can still iterate. Even when we were working in a more waterfall, even when we work today with customers that are like you, this is the way that we're currently building software. Maybe it's a cultural change. We're working towards working in a more agile way. But right now, this is how it is, and we need help. You can still take that UX process and iterate through those processes, even if you're not working in tandem with development. Now, obviously, what you're doing is you're missing those inputs from the technology team. You already have edicts coming down from the business in the business requirements document or the ultimately just the requirements. When we talk about Agile, when we talk about user stories, a user story is not necessarily a requirement, right? It's a suggested way of solving a problem based on a need. I'm the user, and I need to accomplish this task, and I need to do it now. Okay? That's not really a requirement. That's just an idea of how we're going to try to. That's a problem, right? It's a need, and so we're trying to solve that from that perspective. Sometimes you can work in an iterative fashion, and somebody's going to go eventually write a BRD document item for that user story. Happens all the time, right? Part of the internal cadence of software development, being able to track and be held accountable for what you're developing, right? So there are things that happen after that. It's not that you never have to write business requirements, but depending on your situation, if you want to work in a UX, in a more agile UX fashion, you can still iterate. I can still break those in and say, hey, we're going to take this section of requirements and let's prototype and vet some ideas, keeping the holistic view of what we're trying to build intact, right? When we talk about breaking these into sprints, I want to make sure that I'm very clear about this. You're not just saying, I'm only going to focus on this and build it, and then I'm going to consider the next set of user stories. You've been part of the backlog grooming, right? You understand the big picture, what we're trying to accomplish from a software perspective. So as a good consultant or as a good software development professional, you're going to take that holistic view and say, you know what, I know I'm writing these particular user stories, but I know that there's a user story down that we put into into sprint 4 that's maybe not as important, but it's going to affect what I'm doing now, so I need to keep it in mind. That holistic approach is critical. Now again, if you find yourself in a situation where you're handed business, you're handed a BRD, business requirement documents, and it happens all the time with development, right? You start a project and they say, here's what you're building. No inputs, make it happen. So I don't know if I answered your question, but what I want to do is I want to position this as a framework, almost like if you're building, when you're coding and you're starting in Visual Studio, you create a C# project, a solution, and you've got your projects, and you separate your web project from your desktop project and your mobile project, right? In the same way that's a framework, you might make different choices on how you're building your software from a development perspective. You can do the exact same thing with the UX component of this. Really what we're doing is we're taking that agile process and we're saying there are additional activities and deliverables that can help fuel this process, right? That same fuel can be used in any process, right? We still need to go through the steps. It's just how we step through them. You still need to have some type of an idea of what you're building. You still need to go through some type of a design phase. You still need to write the code. You still need to test it. These are things that have to happen, whether they happen in a linear waterfall way or whether you iterate through them and are able to then make changes along the way without having to develop software and then 6 months down the line realize, wow, we really messed this up. The users hate it. We need to redo it. Okay?
Yeah, I think I didn't get my answer.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead and let's restate that. Yeah.
So how the UX designer and the VA works together in this? Because there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, absolutely.
Both are ideating.
Yes.
So how does it work?
Yeah, so I would say, so the question for those on the phone is, how does the UX designer and the BA work effectively during kind of that initiation and then throughout the project, right? Okay, so the business is really the main connection point for the analyst, right? They're the ones that are talking to the business. They understand what the business is trying to accomplish. They understand the data. They understand the pieces that are moving around. They're the ones that are kind of owning that. They're really the owners of the backlog. The UX designer is providing input into the backlog. So they're working with the BA and the designer are like this because there is a lot of overlap. The BA is asking questions of the stakeholders. What does this need? What do you guys need to do with this software? What is this supposed to accomplish? What does this task do for the user? The designer is talking to the user and saying, hey, the business is, if it's an existing software application or something new, the business is trying to solve some problems here, and they're going to give you this application that does this. What do you think? Solicit some feedback. Then we can go back during that backlog grooming and tell the business analyst, hey, the users think that's a terrible idea. They think that that's awful. Or, hey, they think that's great. And then they also asked for this. Can we add that? So it's again, if I could circle back and say that there's one thing, I mean, and this, again, common sense, communication between the different areas, rather than working in a silo, rather than waiting for the business analyst to create a document and hand it over, let's collaborate. There's going to be inputs from the designer. There's going to be inputs from technology, inputs from QA. All of these different inputs into that backlog. This is why it's a living document rather than just a static doc, right? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm glad we were able to circle back to it. Okay. Does this make sense when I talk about the different activities that we can do in a sprint zero? We can kind of set some foundation and then iterate through creating, just like we're iterating pieces of code, we're iterating parts of the solution from a UX perspective. If I show this example of an iteration, I usually, as a designer, I usually start, sketching, whether it's on a whiteboard, whether it's in a notebook. I vet some ideas. You were asking about, getting started with some of the ideas. Somebody's asking about getting prototyping, getting started with prototyping earlier. Starting to vet ideas in my notebook while we're talking about requirements is something that I'm probably going to do. I'm going to start, writing down notes and capturing ideas that I'm having while we're having those conversations. I don't have to wait till they're over. Part of the process. Into the medium fidelity wireframe, so I've got a sketch over here of this application that we built. This is an application that my team built for part of the Modern Apps Live conference as part of Visual Studio Live. And so we started off with some simple pencil sketches, and then I threw it into a prototyping tool just to kind of make something a little more medium fidelity that I could then wire up and click and step through the screens. But at some point I needed to bring visual design in there. Right? Now the nice thing about this particular example is I was the primary stakeholder, so I could kind of just design for myself in this situation. But typically what I would do is I would work with marketing, I would work with the branding team, I would work with the technology team. What are we trying to capture not only from a visual perspective but from an interaction perspective? So this is a good example of, I think, how you can iterate. So you're starting with something very, very low fidelity, pencil sketch in a notebook, to something that's more digital, but again, still very placeholder, and then into some more high fidelity visual design. Once I get those designs in place, then you might say, that's really great, but I don't like that list. I want to see them in a horizontal grid instead. Okay, so let's go ahead and pivot. That was feedback that we got from the business stakeholder, so let's do that. And then, we want to go ahead and go with a more monotone look. So let's iterate one more time and pull all the colors out and just have white on black or white on gray. Okay, simplistic example, but again, it illustrates how we can step through and iterate from that initial idea down to something that approximates the idea. I feel like I was pretty close to what I was trying to capture, but you went through a couple of different iterations to actually get that final sign-off on that screen. Okay, just a little illustration of stepping through the iterations. How are we doing on time?
Have about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes, perfect. So I've got a couple more slides, and then hopefully we'll have a little more Q&A and a little more discussion. I really appreciate you guys raising your hands during the discussion. I hate waiting for questions all the way at the end, because then I have to jump back and say, what were we talking about? But lessons learned. These are some of the things that, just in my experience and my team's experience, things to think about when we're looking at integrating those UX deliverables and activities into that Agile process, regardless of what that UX process is. Everybody's got their own little flavor. Everybody does things just a little bit differently. But testing and feedback is really the critical part of why we want to do this in an iterative fashion. Getting those prototypes in, soliciting feedback before we spend a lot of time writing code, validating our ideas, and then being able to confidently code and develop the ideas. Has anybody ever read a book by Krug called Don't Make Me Think, UX book? Maybe the designers have, right? Don't make the user think. The goal is an intuitive, pleasant experience. I want to be able to open up an application or go to a website and understand how it works immediately based on my lifetime of experience with digital systems. So let's leverage design patterns. Let's leverage an intuitive and existing paradigm where we can and where is appropriate. So again, removing some of that friction. When we talk, one of our practice leads and solution architects in our mobile group often talks about those frictionless mobile experiences. And what he means by frictionless means it just works. This is the goal. We've heard Steve Jobs from Apple talk about this all the time. It just works. As systems get more complicated, sometimes they don't just work like as they are intended, but that's the goal, right? Don't make the user think. Let's provide them an intuitive experience and lead them through the process to, again, increase that productivity and make them more productive and affect that bottom line. Empathizing with the users. When we talk about why we have discovery and user research, we want to put ourselves in the user's shoes. I'm not designing an application for me. I'm not designing it for the business stakeholder. I'm designing it for their users. Now, ultimately, there are inputs from the business that might conflict with what the user wants. Happens all the time. The business says, this is what we're going to do. The user wants something else, and the business says, we can't do it, or that's not the way it's going to be. Sometimes you have to reconcile what the business is trying to accomplish and what the users want. Ultimately, I think a responsible way to respond to users is to give users what they need and want. Sometimes what they ask for and sometimes what they need are two different things. User research helps capture some of this. We can read between the lines and effectively put ourselves in their shoes and understand what are their pain points and how are we going to then service them. Keeping the big picture in mind but focusing on the task at hand. I think this goes back to what we were just talking about a little bit, being too myopic when we're within a sprint, a design sprint, but then not having a good perspective of the overarching application or goal that we're trying to accomplish. Let's look a little bit down the lines and make sure we keep that holistic view in mind when we're designing and developing. This is one that always makes people cringe, but give yourself permission to fail. You hear this a lot when you talk about agile or iterative development. Because we're on these little short time frames of vetting ideas, sometimes we'll get some ideas, we'll come up with what we think is a really great solution, we'll get it in front of stakeholders and users, and it doesn't meet the needs. That's okay sometimes. We learn from our mistakes, we pivot, we iterate, and then we try again. Now, when this happens, you learn early on what's going to work and what's not. So if you do fail, you'll probably fail up front. Hopefully you're not failing in sprint 6 or 7 or 8. But again, giving yourself permission to say, it's okay, you know what? We tested some ideas, it didn't work, but we now have valuable input. Now we know what doesn't work. How many times have you guys heard a stakeholder say, I don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it? Sometimes you fail giving them what you think they want, but nope, that's not it. I'm looking for something, but that's not it. So I think it's okay. And then communication, I've mentioned this a couple of times. Again, this seems like common sense, but we often forget to have inputs and outputs from different teams. Talk to the developers, talk to the designers, talk to the stakeholders, talk to the users. These are all open communication channels during the process that are going to help us keep our eye on the ball. Okay, communication, it was just funny because ultimately what we're doing is building software. We're in the communications business, right? But sometimes we forget to communicate. So collaborate and communicate. Yes, sir?
How do you establish scope in an agile environment? With scope creep and having continually iterating, when do you eventually draw the line?
Yeah, so the question is how do you avoid scope creep in agile or iterative? So if you were to talk to like a scrum master or to a project manager that's running a project, ultimately they're the ones that are responsible for keeping everybody in line, right? So you talked about scope creep within an agile environment. So let's say that you go through and you vet some ideas, you prototype, you even do some development, and then the business comes back to you and says, hey, we want to add an additional feature. That's okay, because what you're doing is you're just basically adding on another sprint, right? There's complete visibility into what this is costing them. In a waterfall situation, they probably said, we're going to give you $500,000 to build this mobile application. And you sign your name on the dotted line and you're stuck to that number. Now you also have to then really fight with them every time they see an idea and it gives them a new idea or they want to add features. That's a very contentious relationship. This is another advantage of building software iteratively. Is there's complete, you don't have to change order the client to death, right? They understand that they're basically paying for 2-week increments of your time. You could get 4 weeks into it and the client might say, you know what, this isn't working for us. Thank you, you guys have been great, but now that we are starting to see some of our ideas, the business thinks we're going to move in a different direction. Happens all the time. The nice thing about Agile is you're not held to that change. There's an understanding that if they want to make some changes, well, you want to add these 3 features, we think that's going to be another sprint, that's another 2 weeks. They say okay, and you add it onto the end of the or inject it into the project wherever it could be. So the concept of scope creep doesn't really happen, from my perspective, in iterative or agile development. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, oh yeah, scope creep's awful. Yeah, you don't want any of that. So earlier I talked about tools. I like to start sketching and prototyping just with pen and paper, or pencil and paper, but people often say, what is your favorite tool? What do you like to prototype in? 9 times out of 10, we are in digital tools. Again, working effectively with developers, making sure that we're communicating ideas. I like to throw the fact that you can use a prototyping or design tool like Balsamiq or Blend. Anybody ever used SketchFlow as part of Blend before Microsoft end-of-lifes it? Awesome tool, I used to love it. Indigo Studio, Infragistics, has a tool that lets us do rapid prototyping. You can share prototypes online in a secure website environment. You can solicit feedback. There's a lot of really great tools to vet your ideas, especially if you're working in a situation where you don't have direct access to your users or your stakeholders. If I'm in Chicago and my stakeholders in San Francisco, how do I show them the prototypes? Well, I might use a program like Principal or Origami and vet those prototypes out on a device and send him an application that he can actually put on his device and interact with. Maybe he wants to look at it on a website. There's a lot of different tools and methodologies for testing ideas. I put PowerPoint and Keynote up there because I've been in situations where I was at a client and we were on their laptop and we had no software. I couldn't put any of my design software on, and so I had PowerPoint. So we prototyped and wireframed in PowerPoint because it was the tool that we had at hand at that point. So using what you have access to is really the point here. But there are a lot of really cool ones. Even if you're working in iOS, Xcode, it's very easy to mock up screens and wire them up so you can communicate interaction and animation and user flows right inside of Xcode and then deploy them to a device. So if you're looking at developing for mobile or web, there are multiple tools. Sometimes we'll prototype in HTML and CSS. Can be ultimately consumed into the development environment. There's some advantages there as well. Okay, so I like to throw those up there because let me also state that you don't have to be a designer to use a prototyping tool. You can use these tools to vet ideas and share them with the rest of the team. How many developers find themselves filling the role of the designer on a project? Any of the, no? Oh, awesome. You guys always have a designer if you're a developer? You guys are awesome. That's super rare. Usually I'm in a room with people that every developer raises their hand that they have to be the designer on their project. That's great. So to summarize, we talked, the whole point of this conversation was to start thinking about how to integrate UX, deliverables, and activities into an agile or an iterative process. So we talked a little bit about why that matters, why we even think about agile development, what user experience design is, and then talked about some of the different activities and deliverables and how we start to fit those in. Now, this is what has been successful for me and my team, and we've been developing and we fine-tune this, and it's always being tweaked, and we're always looking at different ways of providing these approaches and how we work in tandem and collaborate, and it changes all the time. Originally, we were always working in 2-week design sprints, and then we said, you know what, no, we can really do this in 1 week. We can really rapidly get these ideas in front of users and stakeholders and vet them out. Why wait 2 weeks to show it to them? Let's show it to them tomorrow. So the tools and the approaches have really helped with that. And as we get new tools and as new ideas come to bear, I expect that this is going to continue to be easier and much more prevalent within software development. Okay? Into open discussion. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question. I have more of a comment. And first, I'd like to compliment you on your approach. Having worked on an agile team for the past couple of years where we are utilizing UX design. One of the things that I consistently heard, I think we were all looking for maybe that perfect formula of, how this all blends together. And you kind of kept reiterating rather, that, it's a matter of fluidity, common sense, kind of doing finding that sweet spot for your team. And I think you kind of validated our activities. Thank you. I think you kind of validated our activities for the past couple of years, and so I appreciate that. Also, I don't know if this protocol or not, but I was wondering if a copy of this deck would be accessible.
You bet. So this is my email, anthonyh@magenic.com. I'm probably just going to throw this up on some type of a share, probably maybe even just our Magenic website, and or
If you send it to me, I'm going to kind of distribute it.
Awesome. There's the answer. Yes, it will be distributed. Yes, sir. I will distribute it. But yes, absolutely. And my contact information is on here. If you want to have continuing dialogue, let's make sure that we do that.
I'd
Everybody
love
can
to do
please
that.
reach
Thank you
out.
very much, Anthony. As I said, I think you really bring a real world approach to how you're vetting and explaining it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation, it was excellent. We have been doing agile development for about 3 or 4 years, and so my question is about estimating again. So you've got a client who comes to you and they want you to do this application, and we have a budget, but we're not going to tell you what it is. And so, so go estimate this, and you got a week or two to do it.
Sure.
So we do that, and as you know, having been an agile developer, you start out with these epics, and they get broken down into user stories, and you do your best to know up front. So you got a user story that you've kind of, or a set of user stories you've kind of sketched out, so you can do a roadmap and an estimate. Then you start developing in that user story as you start working with the stakeholders and the users and everything. Turns out to be 10 times as big as you. So how do you handle situations like that in your, and how do you take an assignment like that and come up with an estimate in a couple weeks when you've got a 12-month project to do in the Agile?
Yeah, so the question, if anybody didn't hear it, I don't know where we're getting beeped on, if people not hearing. The question was how do you deal with estimation, potentially being wrong about an estimate or having things change after you've estimated and potentially having the increased scope or wow, this is really bigger than I originally thought. So there's a couple of different inputs, I think, into that. So first of all, I would say, just like when we were talking about how we avoid scope creep, is the fact that that business requirements document is not the backlog, right? You're working with a backlog that's, again, as we mentioned, a living document. So to be fair, inputs into that come from all directions. They come from the business stakeholders, they come from the users, they come from the project team. So if you raise your hand after 2 days of working with some user stories and you're like, wow, we really underestimated this, it's responsible to go back to the project team and say, you know what, we really think that this is, going to take us 3 sprints to design instead of 1. Hey, wow, you know what,
Too late, you've already signed the contract.
Again, that's the thing with Agile is again, I know that when you're looking at how you're signing a contract and what the agreement is, but the idea behind Agile is you can come back and say, you know what, hey, or what if the impact of the data that you didn't have access to when you were estimating that user story, now suddenly you have access to it and you're like, wow, this is completely different than we were led to believe or that was communicated to us or that we anticipated, right? Again, Agile lets us have those conversations, and that's the great thing about this process is I don't have to come back and say, God, wow, I promised this to you in 2 weeks, it's going to take me 4, I guess I'm going to eat the 2 weeks. You're able to go back and say, based on new information we have, this is going to change. Right? And certainly you can have that dialogue and they can maybe fight you on it or they can maybe make some changes. But if you're going back and they've decided to work with you as a responsible partner and you're being honest with them, you're like, you know what, not every other situation we thought we were right on, but this one we really think it's more. When you're establishing that relationship, they should be able to say, you know what, either that's, we're going to go ahead and then, yes, let's go ahead and extend it to another sprint, or maybe they're going to cut it, or maybe they're going to move it to version 2. But I would not sit on it. I would definitely raise your hand and say, whoa, it's better to say mea culpa, right? And hey, wait, we talked about allowing yourself to fail. That includes with estimation. When you're talking about planning poker, again, there's still some guesswork in there. I mean, as you develop software and you build expertise and you're like, hey, we've built 1,000 mobile applications. We know what it takes. We have a pretty good idea. Experience is going to help you be more accurate on that, as you probably have found. But you're not always going to get it right.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we've done a lot of the things that you mentioned. It's just that, so the whole thing about it's impossible to estimate a waterfall project. You still have a lot of the same problems with Agile. They're just, you discover them earlier, and you can have those conversations earlier. Doesn't make those conversations necessarily more pleasant.
Or that they're any smaller, right? The problem is sometimes you still have big problems in Agile, yes.
The question is, I'm still looking for somebody to give me the magic bullet.
When you've got my email. If you find it, I want to call, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I've got the question.
If there was a magic bullet, you would be very rich.
Years, and I still haven't. I've still failed to find anybody who could accurately estimate software development.
And I think Agile is in response to the fact that sometimes maybe it's always going to be
And it's
impossible.
helped us a lot, and we have strategies for dealing with that with trust with customers.
Sure.
But, so I just always like to ask that question. Because
Sure.
these days, somebody's gonna have the magic wand.
Somebody's going to give you a book and tell you exactly how it's done, right? Yeah.
So,
One more question, yes, sir.
yes, I have a point to make on that context actually. So
Sure.
it's I think the notion of people saying or conceiving agile as a replacement for waterfall, I don't think that's a valid statement, because it's still valid in his case where the waterfall is more appropriate than agile, because in agile is ideally suitable for a small scale and applications which are with a small application to build and quick deliver, and rather than a 12-month project which is a long tenure. I don't think agile is flexible enough to adopt for a larger scale projects where you have a big team and big deliverables, which is long scaling applications. So I think, well, there are notions of using a scrum of scrums, of course. You
Sure.
could split the whole big project into small chunks and handle each chunk into a sprint of its own. But I think it's still adopting stage. I don't think replacement. I think within every sprint you have a waterfall, no matter what.
Absolutely.
So there is a
Many
waterfall
waterfalls within
component
sprints.
always embedded into the whole equation. I think so that's my notion to it.
Yeah, to be fair, Agile is not, as we talked about silver bullet, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are instances where, regardless of what those inputs are, sometimes you maybe will work with a client or with a project team to develop in a waterfall way, and it makes sense in that context. So when you're working to imagine what that project is going to be, sometimes you might say, you know what, based on certain factors, based on access to users or based on data that we don't have or information that we don't have or changing requirements, we might not be able to approach this in an iterative fashion. We need to take the time and write out a BRD, write our business requirements document down, capture everything and have that roadmap, that solid roadmap. Agile is not a replacement for waterfall, it's an alternative, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's why
completely
most of the
agree.
projects get failed when they adopt agile in the first place itself. I think it's more of a discipline than the process, actually.
I think that's fair to say that, yes, Agile is more of a discipline than a process, sure. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about if you're working within UX design and you work in an iterative fashion, it's not that you're changing the process, it's that you're working within that competency.
Absolutely.
Yep, fair enough.
Questions from the line? Anybody online?
Yes, do we have any questions from the internet? That's probably, they're probably blowing up, let's see.
No, they're there. Just they need to unmute their.
Oh yeah, if anybody on the line wants to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute and we should be able to hear you. Going once? Going twice? All right, guys, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you guys coming out and giving up your lunch hour to listen to me ramble. Take care, thank you.